So in this and the next episode, I welcome Jordan Peterson to our unit. This is a video that is critical about some of Jordan Peterson's work, but my criticism is not of the man, only of some of his ideas. Certainly, he is a persuasive speaker, and I've got no doubt that his self-help books have helped many people. And that's led him to having quite a large and devoted following, who become angry at people like me who criticize what he says. And I've had personal experience of this. So I want to make it clear, I'm not attacking Jordan. For one, that would be highly individualistic, and that is an approach I critique. I'm critiquing the arguments he promotes regarding race and gender. He's also not the only psychologist to have said the things he's said, but he's a very high-profile psychologist because of his presence on social media. So that's why he's here on our unit. So if you're a fan of Jordan, don't worry, you'll be fine, he'll be fine. And please don't troll me. I'm going to offer a critique of one of Jordan's public talks on race and IQ and gender and employment. I'm just showing short sections of his talk, but you can watch the full video of his talk via the link in the description box on YouTube and on our Moodle page as well, if you're a student studying the unit. So let's begin.
So what? So IQ is reliable and valid. That's the first thing. It's more reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists by a factor of about 3.
Okay, let's stop there. He says IQ is reliable and valid. And that sounds a clear and definitive statement, but the problem is that reliability and validity are measured on a nominal scale from 0 to 1, but it's neither 0 or 1. It's somewhere in between. So you can't say something is reliable and valid with absolute certainty because it's a measure of probability. It's important to correct him here because he's talking as though this thing is certain when it isn't. But he does correct himself in a minute, so that's fair enough. The other problem is that he then goes on to say that IQ testing is the most reliable and valid of all the psychometric tests by a factor of about 3. And that sounds really impressive, unless psychometric tests are generally poor. Then saying that one of those tests, i.e. IQ tests, is good because it's the best one, doesn't mean it's a good test. It just means it might be a little less poor than the others. And in the case of psychometric testing, we know they are generally quite poor tests of human attributes and human behavior when it comes to reliability and validity.
Fact number 2 is it predicts long-term life outcome at about 0.3, 0.4, which leaves about 85%, 70 to 85% of the story unexplained, but it's still the best thing that we have.
Now, here we get to another fact, but it isn't another fact. The extent to which IQ predicts long-term life outcomes is a measure of validity, which is called predictive validity. He's making the same claim as before. It's important to point that out because otherwise you might think that he's citing an accumulation of supporting evidence. It's not an accumulation, it's a repetition. But we do get more detail on that initial fact claim that the predictive validity of IQ testing is around 30%, which is low. A coin toss would be better. So IQ testing does appear to be the best of a bad lot.
This is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. So I'm hesitant to broach the topic. But I'll tell you one thing that I did in the last week that's relevant to this. And this just shows you how complex the problem is. First of all, we should point out that race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. And that's a big problem from a scientific perspective. But we'll leave that aside.
Now here, he's getting into his argument, a thing he talks about a lot, which is that intelligence is genetically determined and as such it is hereditary and immutable. So you can't change it. because it's not significantly impacted by our social environment. You're as stupid or as clever as your parents are, and your kids are going to be as stupid or as clever as you are, and there's little to nothing that's going to change that. That's essentially his argument, and that leads him to argue that social inequalities are in fact normal and natural as they reflect the genetic distribution of competence across the population, with intelligence being one measure of competence. And that's the basis for his argument to explain why black people and women experience social inequality. And at this point, he's focusing on race and IQ. The first thing he does is to identify a counter-argument, but he does so just to move it out of the way, so that you think it's been dealt with. The problem is that it's a very strong counter-argument, that it can't be easily brushed aside. Here's the rub of it. If you can't assign people reliably to a racial group, you can't make reliable observations of group differences based on race. He's absolutely right. Race is hard to define, not least because there's no genetic basis for race. That's the broad consensus among geneticists. So any argument that one racial group is less intelligent than another because of genetic differences is false.
Somebody stood up at one point in one of my talks, and Vice, bless their hearts, took this particular question and used it as an indication of the quality of the people who are my so-called followers. And by the way, the quality of my so-called followers is pretty damn high. And you can find that out quite rapidly just by looking at the YouTube comments, which are head and shoulders above the standard set of YouTube comments, I can tell you that. So someone asked me about the Jewish question, right? And the implication, it was actually someone Jewish, and the implication was that Jews are overrepresented in positions of authority and power. And I had just spoken for like an hour and a half, and you know, this guy had an axe to grind, and I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm getting into this at the moment. And so I said I can't answer that question. But that's not a very good answer. So I wrote a blog post this week, and I said, look, here's the situation. All right. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then let's open our eyes a little bit, eh? And think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us. So let's not confuse competence with power and authority, even though that's a favorite trick of the radical leftists, who always fail to make that distinction. Well, why does this overrepresentation occur? Because it does. There's also overrepresentation in political movements, including radical political movements. Okay, why? Well, answer 1, Jewish conspiracy. Okay, that's not a very good answer. We've used that answer before.
Here, he's firming up his argument about race and IQ. He's already told us that racial groups are very hard to define, but he's pushed that counter-argument away. Now he's citing Jewish people as a racial group and stating they have a higher IQ than everyone else. Why does he think this is a good example? Well, it might be because one of his main audiences, is receptive to this argument. One of the main audiences for Jordan Peterson's work on race and IQ are groups known as the alt-right. These are groups who hold extreme right-wing views that oppose racial, gender, and religious equality. They mainly push their arguments via social media, and Jordan's main audience comes to him via social media. And Jordan's reflected on this himself, and he's quick and keen to disassociate himself from right-wing extremism. But that's usual for academics who advocate these views on race and IQ. They reject any criticism that they're politically motivated or politically affiliated. They claim that they're just objective scientists revealing uncomfortable truths that others then politicize. But here we have a nuance. Those right-wing groups tend to be anti-Semitic. They hate Jewish people. Not only is Jordan very clear about opposing anti-Semitism, He also uses an example here of how Jewish people are a racial group who are more intelligent than other groups. So that would seem to put distance between himself and the alt-right. But Jordan does have a political identity, and he will talk about it when pushed. He will refer to himself as on the political right in terms of being a conservative thinker, and there's some reason to think that he holds beliefs that align him with conservative Christian thinking, as he does identify himself also to be a Christian, and he appears to support socially conservative policies, and he appears to want to apply his understandings of Christianity to law and public policy. That's essentially what conservative Christians do. Now, certainly, his arguments make sense from a conservative Christian standpoint, because some in that group strongly align with Christian Zionism. This is the support for the idea that Jewish people should return to the land of Israel, and some Christian Zionists believe that once this is accomplished, and then when Jewish people subsequently convert to Christianity, it will signal the second coming of Christ. So Jewish people are a group who are important to some Christian conservatives. But there's also been an alignment between some conservative Christian groups and Mormonism. Historically, Mormons held a view that black people were descended from Cain, the figure in the Bible who's cursed because he killed his brother Abel. God got pretty upset with Cain for doing that and cursed him. Black people, according to Mormon scripture, were descended from Cain, so they're the cursed people. So that's pretty racist. And Jordan's argument that Jewish people are genetically hardwired to have high intelligence and black people are genetically hardwired to have low intelligence resonates with those conservative Christians who align with Christian Zionism and with Mormonism. That's not to say that Jordan is that type of a conservative Christian, but just that his views are well received and supported by that group. And the conservative Christians are a very, very powerful group in the United States. One of the most politically powerful. It's the group that Donald Trump gains much of his support from. These are groups that have a lot of money and a lot of influence. And the final audience that Peterson's arguments fit agreeably with are the eugenicists, those who essentially argue that white people are the genetically superior race. Eugenics, now known as scientific racism, was the foundation of the Nazi program of mass killings, the Holocaust, and it was the ideology that fueled the slaughter of First Nations people in Australia in the early years of colonization. And it's the foundation to the ongoing racism directed against First Nations people today. We'll talk about that some more in our week on First Nations people. So it's those arguments that promote the idea that there are genetic differences between racial groups that fuels that hatred. Eugenics has been utterly discredited, but it still influences some people in psychology. Genetic arguments are actually quite easy to discredit, unless you're wearing cultural blinkers. So in the case of Judaism, well, it's well known that there are strong cultural norms amongst Jewish communities that value study. This has its historical roots in the importance of the study of Jewish religious texts like the Torah. And the argument here is that those cultural norms has transformed into the general promotion of the value of study among Jewish families. And that might be why some Jewish people do particularly well in education, and that means they do particularly well on intelligence tests. So in the next video, we'll look at what Jordan goes on to tell us about genetics and gender, and why women do not have equal standing with men, according to Peterson. Women do not have equal standing with men in education or employment because they're biologically determined to be less competent than men in those areas. And then we'll come back to further critique those ideas on race. So till then, ta-da.